Welcome everyone to an online presentation in order of Women's History Month, in which we are going to introduce you to Eliza Scidmore. She was a pioneering female journalist who can be described as a botanical ambassador for Japan and its cherry trees. My name is Kathleen Emerson-Dell, and I am the museum specialist here at the U.S. National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Diana Parcell, whose biography of Eliza Scidmore has just been published by Oxford University Press. Diana is a professional writer, editor, and former journalist who has worked at the National Geographic, the National Institutes of Health, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Washington Post, as well as several environmental research centers in Southeast Asia. She is a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism and Johns Hopkins University, and she received a Mayborn Fellowship in Biography and the Biographers International Organization's 2017 Hazel Rowley Prize. We are excited to hear more about Eliza Scidmore and her botanical adventures in Japan and elsewhere. Please put your questions into the chat, and we will have time at the end of Diana's presentation to answer some of those. And without further ado, as they say, I will turn it over to Diana. Welcome.
Hi, it's really a joy to be here. And of course, as you've already mentioned, it's very appropriate because of Women's History Month, but also because, of course, this week marks the 111th anniversary of the planting of the first two cherry trees that were donated in a batch of 3,000 that were sent to Washington in 1912. So a pretty special time of year for us. And my goodness, here we are right in the peak season of those trees, which, you know, the idea came from Japan, and yet these are so associated with Washington and have become such an iconic image, I think, in terms of how we think about the nation's capital. So the cherry trees, this is a biography primarily of Eliza Scidmore, but I kind of see it in some ways as a biography of the cherry trees as well. And the reason for that is that it really is a major strand in her story. It's not her only legacy by any means, but it's certainly the one that people who have heard of her at all know anything about. And so she was significant, as I'm going to explain to you today, because she really was the first to propose the idea of cherry trees in Potomac Park. She kept at that for over 20 years. It became an obsessive quest with her. But something you may not have known is that she was also the chief intermediary with Mrs. Taft for arranging that gift of the trees from Japan. And I'll explain how that came about. And it really reflects the nature of her extraordinary career as a journalist and travel writer, and her connections to an awful lot of people in high places. So in a sense, she introduced the idea of planting cherry trees in DC, but you know, if you think about it in a larger sense, she was really, she had an influential role in shaping the modern landscape of Washington. So as I explained in the book, a lot of that legacy comes from her longtime affiliation with Japan. She developed a deep admiration of the Japanese and their culture, including their mastery in gardening. And we know she got the idea for the flowering cherry trees in 1880s after she started traveling to Japan and first saw them in bloom. But what I felt, or what I concluded after researching her life, is that there's another important influence in her vision of the trees, and that is her deep affection for Washington as her adopted home, her work as a journalist and travel writer, as I've already mentioned, and her own love of plants and gardens. So one of the surprise discoveries for me in the book, which I'll explain a little later, is that finding there were some roots of her vision of the cherry trees reaching back even before her time in Japan. So I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about her, but just to kind of set the stage, I'll give you a few biographical details. She came from modest beginnings, born in Clinton, Iowa in 1856, and she spent her first few years in Madison, Wisconsin, where her mother's parents had settled. So at the age of 5, during the Civil War, she came to Washington with her mother and her brother, George. So she grew up here. She got her early schooling at an elite convent school in DC. I don't know how long she attended there. I was only able to find records for the first couple of years. But those records were revealing because it showed the nature of her intelligence and her precociousness at a young age. At the end of the first grade, she was awarded prizes in 2 areas that really presaged her future career. One of those was reading and spelling, and the other was geography. So she told an interviewer late in life that she loved as a child playing with maps and a globe. I was always planning journeys, she said. My daydreams were always of other countries. She attended Oberlin for about 18 months, but never graduated. And this takes us to really the part of her life that I'm going to dwell on today, which is when she became a journalist. Now, I've already mentioned that her love of Washington as her adopted home becomes a theme in her story. So when she first came to Washington, this is basically what Washington looked like. It was a pretty shabby place. And this happens to be the canal, the silted up canal that used to run along the north edge of the National Mall, where we today have Constitution Avenue. So as a young reporter, she became a reporter in 1876, remarkably enough, at the age of 19. She got her journalistic start covering the Philadelphia Centennial, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the founding of America. So, or the Constitution, rather. So she became a society columnist in Washington, and she went on to do that for quite a number of years, writing for a newspaper in St. Louis. I found this an interesting part of the book because I didn't realize that there were quite a number of female correspondents working in Washington after the Civil War. Newspapers were expanding, they wanted to increase their readership, and they were trying to appeal to more women. And they also, as you know, the Gilded Age in Washington was a pretty extravagant time. There were millionaire politicians outdoing one another in lavish entertaining. So a lot of these editors around the country felt that they needed women covering this social scene in Washington. Well, Eliza did that. She wrote for quite a few years, and something that I saw as a theme that would crop up in many of her columns over the years, where she would report not just on the social scene, but on all kinds of developments in Washington, including this gradual beautification of Washington over the years. So this will play very much into the story of the beginnings of Potomac Park and the beginnings of her vision for a cherry tree park there. So in several columns that she wrote, she said outright, Washington grows more beautiful every year. So she followed some of the, a lot of these physical changes and reported on them in the columns. Well, Eliza did the social reporting, but she kind of did something different from her colleagues. And this is kind of certainly an example of her enterprise and her hard work ethic. On the months when she wasn't covering the social scene, she started traveling. So she crisscrossed the country several times. She would pause every few days and write travel letters. So by doing this, combining these two things, social reporting and travel writing, she ended up making a pretty good living and was actually earning more money than some of the male reporters in Washington. Now, a major milestone came. Here she is as a young reporter, and this was taken in 1877 during a trip she made out west, where she actually visited a number of Army forts. And there's a very touching scene in the book where she has an encounter with the Nez Perce, who are being displaced from their homeland in the Northwest area. So one of the big milestones during her reporting occurred in 1883. She went to Alaska. She'd been influenced by John Muir, who had gone to Alaska to study glaciers, so she followed in his footsteps. He had gone there by canoe, or he'd gone here into Glacier Bay by canoe with some native Alaskans to study glaciers, which was one of his interests. Well, she decides that she's going there kind of on a reporting trip and a sightseeing trip. And that trip becomes historic because her ship actually takes a detour and goes up into the north of Glacier Bay, which a ship had never done that before. So she wrote about her experiences seeing this magnificent Muir Glacier. She went back the following summer, repeated the trip, and ended up turning her newspaper dispatches into the first travel guide to Alaska. So she went on to write about Alaska for about 15 years. She wrote a second, even more comprehensive guidebook. So she became one of the major figures in helping to stir the beginnings of Alaska tourism at the end of the 19th century. Now, this reporting on Alaska was so pioneering that it really impressed these eminent scientists at National Geographic, which had been founded in 1888. So she joined the organization and they elected her its secretary, which made her the first woman to serve on the board in 1892. So that also made her a friend of prominent people like Alexander Graham Bell. It put her in contact with people like David Fairchild, whom you know well as an influential person at the National Arboretum. So she wrote about a dozen articles in the end for the magazine and also contributed quite a few photos. But the real importance in the story today and the cherry trees is the next milestone event in her life, which was when she went to Japan for the first time. And that was in 1885, the same year her Alaska book came out. So her brother, George, became a U.S. consular official, and he ended up spending most of his 39-year career in Japan. Mrs. Scidmore decided to go and live with her son. Well, this gave Eliza a home, a part-time home in Japan. So she came and went quite frequently. She became a recognized authority on Japan. She wrote a major book on Japan, and she wrote about Japan for many leading magazines, including the Century Illustrated, which was considered the top think magazine in America. Everybody of any influence read it, from presidents on down. But she didn't just write about Japan. This home that she had, this part-time home in Japan, and her ability to come and go and live with her brother and mother gave her a base for reporting from all across Asia, South Asia. So here you see the lists of the travel books. This last one isn't a travel book, it's a novel, but all of these works that she produced during her 40-year career as a journalist. So here, CPR is the Canadian Pacific Railroad. So she wrote a guide for them, and they subsidized some of her travel. The other thing that was happening when she's doing this reporting is that she's taking photographs. So she had taken up photography in around 1890, about 2 years after the Kodak box camera was invented. So she is also becoming a photographer. She is submitting photographs to the various magazines, which really don't even have the capability at the time to run photos, but they made woodcuts from those photos. And today there are image collections of her photos at National Geographic and also at the Smithsonian, because the Smithsonian ended up lending her a camera and equipment for some of her travels so that she could document them for the National Museum at the time. Here we see a photo that's probably of her in the Smithsonian image collection. Okay, so one of her books, Java, The Garden of the East, became kind of influential in her future association with David Fairchild, because this marks probably about the beginning of when they came to know one another. Eliza visited Java in 1894, and then her book came out in 1897. And she wrote, in that book, she wrote, of course, about the tropical vegetation and all that, and also reported on this world famous botanical garden at Buitenzorg, it was called at the time. Today we know it as Bogor, Indonesia. Well, Fairchild, as a young botanist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, went to Java soon after Scidmore did to do research at that tropical gardens. Soon after that is when he embarked on what you may know as his career as a plant explorer, that he began making these round-the-world trips, collecting specimens of plants and that could be imported to the United States to diversify the agricultural and horticultural crops. So he admired Eliza's Java book and also her expertise on Japan. And in fact, he was so impressed with her knowledge of flowers and plants that he arranged her appointment as an official collaborator in his office for collecting plant specimens. He told his boss, "She's informed us of many useful plants, and no one knows more people in Japan and China than Miss Scidmore." They also had mutual interests at the National Geographic because they overlapped in serving on the board. He was a son-in-law of Alexander Graham Bell, who was the second president of the society, and Eliza knew the Bells quite well. So during his plant collection travels, Fairchild also developed an interest in Japanese flowering cherries. So you may know that he imported about 100 or so to study at his home outside of Washington to see how those trees would grow in the local climate. They did splendidly. So he and his wife, Daisy, shown here, started urging friends and neighbors to plant the trees locally. And then they branched out from this and they teamed up with Eliza Scidmore as partners in efforts to try to bring the cherry trees to Washington. Well, by this time, Eliza had already proposed several times bringing or having some cherry trees planted in downtown Washington along the Potomac. And we're going to get to that in just a few minutes. But as I've already mentioned, Eliza herself was a great fan of flowers and gardens, and it became a favorite subject of her reporting in Japan. She often described her admiration of Japanese mastery of horticulture. Japanese gardeners, she wrote, were necromancers. They were wizards who teased beauty from nature. And a perfect example of that was how they had taken cherry trees from, that were growing in the wild. And over 1,000 years, they had elevated these to new heights of beauty in the different varieties of the blossoms. She, in 1891, in her 1891 book, and for magazines like Harper's Bazaar, she reported on Japanese reverence for nature and the many flower festivals in Japan. In an example of her, how she could, of what a wide interest she had in plants, she took up a study while she was living in Japan of the asago, I'm sorry if I pronounce it wrong, asago, or Japanese morning glories. These were not, the typical morning glories that we see in the backyard growing on a vine against a fence. What the Japanese had done is they had cultivated varieties of this plant that were just, they were remarkable for their spectacular color and their very unusual flowering shapes. And you'll see a couple of examples here. I mean, the petals of the flowers were corkscrewed, they were ruffled. Some of these plants look like orchids and other plants. Well, Eliza just kind of grew engrossed with these, and she took up this fad when it was revived in Japan, and she started growing them herself. They bloomed really early in the morning. So she describes getting up quite early and going off to be able to do research on these plants. She tried getting people in America to grow them. She published this article in the Century magazine. She sent seeds to her friends and her editors in America, trying to get them to grow them. And there was a little bit of press attention on it, but it turns out they were kind of hard to grow. And so this trend never really caught on. But Eliza kept sticking with this study of these, and she ended up lecturing on this topic to the Japan Society in London. And she even published a 35-page scientific paper on her findings. So this tells you that once she found a topic that interested her, she could be pretty obsessive. In another example, she reported on the principles and aesthetics of Japanese gardens. She lectured on the subject at a 2-week garden show in New York City, sponsored by the Japan Society. She published this article, The Famous Gardens of Kyoto, in Century magazine in 1912. The same week that the first cherry trees were planted in Washington, she delivered a lecture on Japanese gardens for the National Geographic Society's public lecture series. And of course, she developed a special interest in cherry blossom trees. She made a serious study of the tree's history and cultural significance that she published in March 1910, when it looked like Washington was finally going to get some Japanese cherry trees. And that article really gave a lot of Americans their first knowledge of Japanese flowering cherries. So during her time in Japan, she grew so enamored of flowering cherries that, as I've mentioned earlier, this kind of became an obsession of hers to bring some of these to Washington. She called them the most beautiful thing in the world, and she wondered why these trees had never been adopted in America's parks and cities. And she saw Washington with its growing tourism in the springtime and its a steady program of beautification as a perfect place to have a park of cherry trees where Americans could enjoy them. Well, it turns out she already had a place in mind, and that was Potomac Park, because she, as a young reporter, had followed the beginnings of the creation of Potomac Park. Here we see the mall looking from the Capitol toward the unfinished Washington Monument in 1877. And this area behind it and to the left of it in this picture was a huge tidal, swampy, marshy land known as the Potomac Flats. And this was just a big mud bank. When the tide rolled in, it came in all the way up to the base of the monument, and then the tide would go out and it would leave this nasty, smelly, mucky area. And so Washingtonians complained about this for years. Eliza reported on it. And then finally, Congress allocated the money to do something about it. And they set about, starting in the early 1880s, to fill in that land and to turn it into a park. So there's a wonderful scene in the book. I won't go into detail, but there's actually a scene from 1883, November 1883, when Eliza is reporting on this project. She goes down to the mall, and to get a better bird's eye view of this work, she goes to the top of the Washington Monument. And by then it was about 400 feet high. And she rode this platform elevator that the workmen went to the top to carry their building materials and all. And she said in her column, as she's looking out on it and describing it later for readers, she said, "This is one day going to be the largest and most beautiful park in Washington, a place of magnificence in future administrations." Well, the interesting thing about this is that this happened in 1883. She had not even yet gone to Japan and seen Japanese cherry trees, but we now know that this created the seeds of a vision in her mind, because she knew that this park was being developed, and so eventually she came to see that as a natural place to put a park of cherry trees. Well, she took her idea about the cherry trees down to the men who were in charge of the city parks. These were the Army Corps of Engineers. They were engineers trained at West Point. They were very conventional in their ideas about landscaping of public parks. And so they politely heard her out, and then they ignored her. And this happened several times over she went in different administrations. She tried, and they listened to her and ignored it. And then a breakthrough occurred in 1909 when William Howard Taft came to the White House. Now, both the Tafts had been quite okay, this shows you really what those flats look like, and just kind of what a nasty wasteland it was. So once they started improving Potomac Park, this was one of the results. There was a roadway going through the park. They were filling in the land. They were creating this tidal basin. And this, of course, is going to become very important later when we see cherry trees that are going to be planted along here. But this gives you the before and after view of the Potomac Park. This was the vision that Eliza had in mind when she went to Japan and saw the trees in bloom. Take a look, you'll notice there's a double row of trees, and that's going to play into the story a little later in terms of shaping her vision. But what she had in mind was, we could say she wanted to bring cherry trees to Washington, but there was a little more going on in her mind, because she loved this ritual that she experienced in Japan called Hanami. Now, the Japanese had been celebrating this for hundreds of years. And really, Hanami is cherry blossom viewing. It is this time when the whole country erupts in joy, and when the trees come into bloom. Everybody goes down to the parks, to the temple grounds, and they ramble together beneath the trees. So Eliza had in mind creating a Hanami experience in Washington. That was very much part of her vision. I love this photo because it reminds me of almost being along the tidal basin today, and you see these crowds coming toward you. There was a place in, before I move on to that, there was a place in Japan that was especially influential. It was a 2-mile avenue of trees along the Sumida River in Tokyo. And it was just this splendid array of trees. And it was kind of a people's park. It was like a festival every spring when the trees were in bloom. And this was really what she had in mind. And in fact, Eliza said over the years when she's writing about her experience of the trees, that and her idea of them is that she wanted to create a Mukojima on the Potomac. So this is the image that she had in mind. Well, as I said, a big breakthrough came when the Tafts came to the White House in 1909. Both William Howard Taft and his wife Helen were big proponents of the development of Potomac Park. They believed that there should be this wonderful gathering place for people, for the public to have recreation. And so they really followed very, very closely the development of Potomac Park. Well, Helen Taft had been trained as a musician, so her idea was to build a bandstand along the river where people could gather for public concerts. So the word about this got out about her plans, and Eliza Scidmore, of course, realizes what Mrs. Taft has in mind is very similar to her vision of creating a park and a public gathering place along the river. So she writes a note to Mrs. Taft asking her if she would consider incorporating some Japanese cherry trees. Well, Mrs. Taft had actually lived in Japan a while. She had a great admiration for Japanese culture, and she jumped at the idea. I won't go into it in great detail, but there is an interesting little parallel here because David Fairchild was also approaching the Army Corps of Engineers about the cherry trees. And even offering to donate 50 trees. But Eliza sent her note to Mrs. Taft directly, and Mrs. Taft jumped at the suggestion. So she started racing ahead in this. And at first they tried to, here's Mrs. Taft's note to Eliza. Thank you very much for your suggestion about the trees. I've taken the matter up and promised the trees. So she is already straight out of the ballpark, taking this up as a personal project. So she tries to get cherry trees from U.S. nurseries, and they were able to find like 90 or so, and they order them. The White House military aide who's helping with this. But in the meantime, Eliza Scidmore's connection with some high-placed Japanese people elevated that project to a much higher level. She that week in Washington, there were a couple of men she knew who were in town for diplomatic events, and one of those men was Jakichi Takamine. He was a Japanese scientist living in New York City, a very wealthy man. And Eliza was telling him and his companion at the time, which was the Japanese consul in New York, about Mrs. Taft's plans. And this is just a few days later after she received the note from Mrs. Taft. And Takamine says to her, I would love to donate 2,000 trees. And the consul tells him, well, maybe we should give them as a gift from the city of Tokyo to the city of Washington. And so that is what they did. And eventually, this man, Yukio Ozaki, took that up as a personal project. He saw this through when things got complicated. Eliza continued to consult with Mrs. Taft. She was the one that actually took the Japanese offer of the trees to Mrs. Taft at the White House. I found a couple of documents that are in the book that I haven't found elsewhere and I haven't seen published elsewhere. And one of them was a letter of March 12th, where she wrote to the consul general in New York saying, Dear Mr. Mizuno, I just came from a meeting with Mrs. Taft at the White House, and she would love to accept your offer of these trees. This is another letter that I found previously unpublished. It was in a letter to her editor. She wrote this article because once they thought they were getting these trees from the Japanese 2,000 trees, she wrote this article on Japanese cherries, and she described all this in a letter to her editor. And here is her sketch saying to him, here is what's going to happen. They are going to, here's the Potomac River, here's Mrs. Taft's bandstand, and here are the trees planted in a double row on the tidal basin. Well, as we know, that's exactly how it turned out. This is about 10 years later after the first trees were planted, but I love that it shows very graphically the layout of those trees around the tidal basin in a double row. But if you know the story, you know that problems cropped up, and that was that when the first batch of 2,000 trees came from Japan, the USDA inspected them and found they were full of pests. And they were very concerned that these non-native pests would damage or be a threat to U.S. agriculture. And so they said these trees have to be destroyed. So all of those trees in January 1910 were burned basically on the grounds of the Washington Monument, where the USDA had some storehouses at the time. So all of Mrs. Taft's dreams and Eliza's dreams went up in smoke. The Japanese were very gracious about it. They came back and said, well, you know, this is disappointing for everyone, but we will send a replacement batch that had been grown under pristine conditions. And so another year and a half or so went by, and finally they sent a replacement batch in the spring of 1912. And this then shows you the site where these trees, the first two in this batch of 3,000 trees, was planted along the north edge of the tidal basin. So this marks the spot today. And you see, these are some of those original trees. I'm told that out of the original 3,000 or so, that fewer than 100 are still existing, but there is this section down on the mall, as you may have visited, which has this grove of incredibly twisted and really remarkable trees that date from the original planting. So that day, Mrs. Taft organizes a pretty small private ceremony to mark the dedication of these trees and to thank the Japanese. So there are only 3 people she invites that day as her special guests to witness the planting. Those people were the Japanese ambassador and his wife, and Eliza Scidmore. So at the age of 50, she was in her 50s, she finally saw the realization of this dream that she had been pursuing for almost 30 years by that time. So I'll wrap up her story. I mean, we don't have a picture of that event. We don't have, the press coverage was minimal. We do have this one photo that shows Eliza Scidmore and Mrs. Taft as they looked a week before that planning. Eliza had gone to New York to give a series of lectures on Japanese gardens for the Japan Society. Mrs. Taft showed up that day with her sister to tour the exhibit, and they got this newspaper photograph. So this tells us what the 2 women looked like a week before they met up in Washington for the historic planting. So Eliza she ended up spending her final years in Europe. She took a big interest in the League of Nations. She moved to Geneva. She never married in her life. Her brother never married. And she was living in Geneva in 1928 when she died at the age of 72. So here they actually took her ashes and carried them to the cemetery in Yokohama, so her ashes could be deposited at the gravesite of her mother and her brother. Here is a plaque. When I went to do research in Japan in 2013, I was amazed at how everyone in Japan knew about Eliza Scidmore. I mean, she was kind of revered as an early friend of Japan. The Japanese emperor had actually given her a medal, the highest civilian medal, in 1908 for her favorable writings on the country. People considered her a loyal friend of Japan at a time when sentiment around the world is beginning to go against Japan because it is becoming so militaristically powerful, having just fought 2 wars and being victorious against both China and Russia. So there was a lot of racism cropping up, and concerns about the so-called yellow peril. And Eliza had remained a very, very outspoken defendant of the Japanese. So today, this is a plaque that is leading up to her gravesite. When I went in 2013, they had just planted 100 trees around the country that were called so-called homecoming trees. So these trees had been propagated from the original 1912 cherry blossom trees that were sent to Washington, and then they were planted in Japan in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of that planting in Washington. So this plaque highlights the role of Takamine and of Eliza Scidmore. So she's all over Japan. And one of the most touching things was that when I went there, I went to her gravesite because for the last 30 years, there's been a group of Japanese that have gone to her gravesite every spring during cherry blossom season to hold a little memorial service and pay tribute to her as a friend of Japan. They have a little plaque that they planted next to her grave, and it says in Japanese, "A woman who loved cherry blossoms rests here in peace." And there is a cherry tree above her that was planted. You can't see it here. It's planted above the gravesite or next to the gravesite, so that there's an overhanging cherry tree that drops its petals, right on her grave. So it's a lovely ending to the story. And at that point, I'm going to stop and take questions.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. The first question we have is related to how you pronounce her name.
It is Scidmore with a silent S. It's not a K. It's not Skidmore. It's a Scidmore SC. She is related to the branch of the Skidmores. It's a family that has roots in England, dating back actually to the 11th century, and she's a 9th generation American.
Oh, interesting. And I had always come across her in my research in Japanese art history studies as of art of the 19th century. She was one of the Western witnesses to a lot of the crafts and the arts that were being created in Japan and sent to the international expositions. And so I was familiar with her articles, and she always prominently used her middle name, Eliza.
Ruhama. She did
Yes.
that in her, certainly in her newspaper work. And I'll tell you that this is one of the things that was a big surprise discovery for me when I set out to research her, and I found not a lot at first at the Library of Congress. So as it turned out, she wrote all her early newspaper work under the name Ruhama. That was her pen name, and I didn't know that. So when I was doing my searches, her material was not coming up. I mean, not a lot of it. Later, as a magazine writer, she used her full name, but Ruhama was her pen name. And once I started finding these newspaper articles, I ended up uncovering something like 800 newspaper and magazine articles she published in her lifetime, which shows her extraordinary productivity as a journalist.
So she was not using her first name.
Well, her books actually were E.R. Scidmore, some of them, and I also came across when I was working in Java, or I was working in Indonesia, and I actually worked in Bogor where this botanical garden was, and it said E.R. Scidmore, the author of this book on Java. Well, I thought this was a great little book. It really held up well. It was informative. It had this very engaging voice. So I read E.R. Scidmore, and I wondered who this guy was and why he went there 100 years ago. And so when I went and did a quick online search and discovered that it was this American woman and that she had this amazing career, I was just stunned. But so she used variations of her name, but mostly just Ruhama as a newspaper reporter, and then as a nationally and internationally respected magazine writer, she began to use her full name.
Mm. So that reflects the difficulties that women had in the 19th century breaking into these male-dominated fields.
Yes, in fact, the Century magazine, she became one of their top writers. And, they didn't have a lot of women writing journalism. Women were contributing poetry and short stories. But the reporting, she was one of their major contributors.
How did you mentioned Java and that you lived in Java. And you read this book and didn't know who she was. How did you become interested or decide that this woman deserved a biography and years of life
Yeah.
doing the research?
I could not believe when I discovered, this was maybe 15 years ago or so, and I was working as a science writer going back and forth to Indonesia and Penang, Malaysia, to work for these science centers. And on one of those trips, I bought this book, Java and Garden of the East. And I just, like I told you, I was stunned to find out that it was a woman. And so when I got back to Washington, I started going to the Library of Congress to see what I could find out. And of course, I had lived here 30 years. I had gone to see those trees every year, and I had never heard this name. So of course, it made me curious about her, where she got the idea for the trees, what took her to Japan, what was her background? What gave this young woman of that era the audacity and the confidence to go and to approach these men who were in charge of the city parks? But it was also as much I was interested in understanding how she managed to achieve all she did as a woman in that era when, as you know, few women had careers, and female ambition was frowned on at that time. So these were questions that, and how she managed to do all that. So I was able to find out some of the influence that help explain how she was able to do what she did.
So one more, I think, or if there are more, please put your questions in the chat. But we've noticed that, why do you think Eliza's role in bringing the trees here has faded so much in this country? As you said that, you had never heard her name.
Yes.
And
why is she obscure in her
right.
native America, and here the Japanese revere her?
And
yes, exactly.
It seems like David Fairchild is the one who gets the bulk of the credit.
It depends on, I think it depends on who's telling the story, and maybe people will quibble with my version. But when I set out to do this book, I knew that the story of the cherry trees was muddied. Over the years, it's a complicated story. It happened over many years. Several people were involved. So there were two batches of trees. So we get a lot of accounts of the origin of the trees, and sometimes they're not fully complete. Sometimes they're not fully accurate. Stories get perpetuated. And of course, it all depends on who is framing the story. So there are people, I'm sure, who will quibble and say, I'm giving Eliza Scidmore undue credit. I have tried to be fair to David Fairchild in the book. I don't know the situation, but one thing that I did when I set out to write the book, I said, I am going to go back to the documents and try to piece this story together. And so when I went back and started doing that, this is when this idea, where I find out that she's followed the entire creation of Potomac Park, and I see that this thread is a much longer one in her story than I believed. I thought, oh, she went to Japan, she got the idea, and it happened. But once I started tracking the story, and then I tracked down these documents that showed she was the intermediary with Mrs. Taft, this to me really validates her importance in this entire story. And that's not to demean David Fairchild. He was an important figure. He was the one that studied the trees. He campaigned to bring them here. He and Eliza worked together. He and his wife and Eliza were partners to an extent. And as I say in the book, I don't know whether they were working in concert when they approached the White House and the Army Corps of Engineers at the same time with their different appeals, or I don't know whether acting in competition? And that's an open-ended question that remains to be answered. They were definitely allies in this. They both wanted it to happen, but neither of them speaks of the other one in their accounts of the history of the trees. So, that kind of raises some questions there, that there may have been a little bit of a falling out or something, maybe over who got the credit or whatever. But all I know is that these were the documents that I had to go on, and that's how I framed the story, is that Eliza really was the first to have that idea. And she was definitely the intermediary between Mrs. Taft and the Japanese. So I think that her intervention with the Japanese, when you think about it, that elevated what had been a fairly modest project to plant some cherry trees along the Potomac in this new spot that Mrs. Taft was beautifying. The Japanese offered to donate a couple thousand trees. Suddenly that kicked this project up to a whole new level. And it was, I believe, Eliza Scidmore's contacts with these high-level Japanese officials that enabled that to happen. Now, I haven't seen, that David Fairchild was involved in those negotiations with the Japanese. He was certainly important in overseeing the receipt of the trees and the inspection, and he was a great advisor in this project. And so, as I say, I'm not trying to diminish his role whatsoever, but my book really does tell the story based on these records that I found. So it's my version, and we may get evidence, further evidence that turns up that shows there is a different set of circumstances, but this is what I came up with.
She just sounds like the most fascinating person, and I can't wait to read this book. See all
I was stunned, I have to tell you, because she keeps, and I call her, if you've read the introduction, I call her a Forrest Gump of her day. Because this woman had this most remarkable ability to hobnob with famous people and to keep turning up at these famous events around the world. She, at World's Fair, she reported on a couple of World's Fairs. She was an eyewitness to several wars. She, the things like, there was an incident in the book where she went to the Philippines thing. Maybe I will write a book on the Philippines. So it's a few months after the Spanish-American War, and it's now under the occupation of the Americans. And she's going out to Manila just to kind of take a look around. And the day she arrives, this insurrection breaks out. The city comes under gunfire, and she has to be hustled off from her hotel with the other Americans to a ship, one of Admiral Dewey's ships in the harbor, and taken refuge for a few days. And it's like, how could this kind of thing keep happening? And the stuff in China in the book is extraordinary. I thought I could dismiss her China book in maybe a page and a half or something, but she wrote a book on China, and it was published. She went to China, it turns out, maybe a dozen times, and she had her finger on the pulse of tensions in China at the time. And she would say to her editors, save space in the magazine, because it is going to be the next story, the next big story. And she wrote a book on China. And then in the summer of 1900, her book comes out at the same time that the Boxer Rebellion is underway in Peking. So the timing and her canny ability to seize every opportunity, also just her finger on the pulse of public affairs was remarkable to me. So she was kind of, it made it easier to live with her for 10 years, because she turned out to be a much more extraordinary and accomplished woman than I had ever realized.
Well, thank you, Diana, for sharing this little introduction to her. We really appreciate it. And as I said, I can't wait to read the book. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm sure we've all learned a lot. It's just been fabulous. So thanks, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you the next time we do something like this.